Well, Samir, I really appreciate you coming on the program with me today. I want to talk about the crisis in the Persian Gulf, something that occupies our attention these days, and for all citizens of our country needs to be a question that's debated and so on. And I want to look at this Persian Gulf situation from a number of different angles, and I know that's of great interest to you and so on. I wonder if you could just tell me a little bit about your own interest in that question and some of the expertise that you bring to bear upon it.
Thank you very much for asking me to be here. This certainly is a very important and timely subject. As you very well know, I don't have any particular academic training in history or political science. I teach linguistics at the University of Toledo. Nonetheless, having been born and raised in that part of the world, in Lebanon in particular, I do have a great deal of interest in what's going on in the Middle East. I do have a great deal of interest in our relationship with Middle Eastern countries. The whole issue of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East intrigues me and interests me.
And is of crucial importance now, isn't it? I mean, that's one of the things we really need to raise in relationship to all of this. Samir, I want to take a particular stance here and say, from my own perspective, in using what we call the Catholic just war criteria, I would like to opt of Iraq at this point. And just to give a little background on that, in the Catholic world, we've had two traditions of how to approach the question of war. One has been the pacifist tradition, represented by people like Tertullian and St. Francis of Assisi and Dorothy Day in our own time. And what it says is that war is out. I mean, that Christians are to be nonviolent, and that when Christ took the sword away from Peter, he took it away from all Christians. So that's been one stance, and people like Philip Berrigan these days are saying, just get the U.S. forces out of the Persian Gulf. Just bring them home, and all talk of forced military means is simply out. Now, the other tradition we've used is called the just war criteria. It was developed in part by St. Augustine and has continued to be developed throughout history. And what it has started with is the premise that you should avoid war at all costs. Christians should be nonviolent, but there might be cases in which it might be valid or legitimate to go to war, and they have raised up certain criteria. Now, one of those criteria is that war is a last resort. And that's a very important one in my mind. In this case, it raises the question of, well, have we dealt well with the region as a whole? Have we tried other means? Are the economic sanctions have any chance of working, and so on? Now, always, I think theological moral reflection has to be in a real historical context and dealing with real-life situations. To me, that's one of the values of the just war theory. It's not just an idealistic position. It forces you to think about what's really going on in the world. Now, I'd like you to help me here a little bit in terms of the history of this situation in the Persian Gulf, Iraq and Kuwait, and that period, and how we've come to this impasse. I think it'll help us with this last resort criteria.
Thank you for asking. I will certainly try. It is, of course, a very complex issue, as I am sure you're aware. The problem with talking about the historical situation in the Middle East would be to say, how far back do you go? And we certainly can go back to Babylon and Mesopotamia and so on. However,
the cradle of civilization, as we call it.
Civilization, you're absolutely right. However, I think to understand what's going on now, it might be an interesting thing to go back to World War I. The period just preceding World War I, and that very important period of time between the two wars, World War I, World War II. The whole area that we know as the Middle East used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. And in reality, there were two political entities in the Middle East for hundreds of years. The Ottoman Empire on the one hand, and Persia, or modern-day Iran. Now, with the collapse of Ottoman authority, with the weakening of the Ottoman Empire, which became known as the sick man of Europe at the time. European.
When you say at the time, you're meaning
around the turn of the century,
right, yeah.
and prior
First World
to
War time, yeah.
First World War, right. And that's when you begin to discover that the European powers, particularly France and England, start colonizing the area known as the Middle East, France in North Africa. The British had already been in India and had a need to have access to the oil of the Persian Gulf and to the Gulf itself. In any case, the Ottoman Empire does collapse with World War I, and the area is divided among the British and the French as mandated territory, with Iraq and Palestine at the time going to the British, Syria and Lebanon going to the French. And this is really the context for the development of nationalism in the Middle East. Before that, people did not feel they belonged to nations as such. Under Ottoman rule, it was interesting to observe that people identified in terms of a certain religion or a certain sect, or what was known in Turkish as the millet system, which simply meant you thought of yourself as a Jew from Baghdad, or a Christian from Damascus, or a Muslim from Beirut. Mm-hmm. And along with civil courts and the civil code, there existed religious courts and religious codes. Now, this is, again, another dimension which is important to understand, because when we talk about the separation of church and state, it is not something which is historically rooted in the Middle East. Yeah. And there
I've noticed in my dialogues with Muslims sometimes that whole idea of the separation of church and state is just absolutely foreign to them. I mean, they have no idea of what that might mean.
You're absolutely right. Mm-hmm. And, when you consider the case of modern-day Israel, we run into the same situation where there seems to be a definite linkage. This is a Jewish state. In any event, what really happened in the Middle East following the mandate is that the British and the French divided the territory, and they controlled the way these nations were to be divided and how they were to develop in later years. And this brings us directly to something interesting, which a gentleman by the name of Percy Cox, who was the British High Commissioner of Mesopotamia, did in 1922. He basically took a map and drew lines, drew borders between modern-day Iraq and Kuwait. Now, Kuwait had been a British protectorate since 1899. However, in 1922, it became a political entity still under British protection. Now, that is not in itself a significant event, because obviously the same thing was done in Africa and in the Middle East, where political borders were drawn. What's important about it, if you look at the map, is that it seems that this resulted in an Iraq which was virtually landlocked. There is no access to the Gulf whatsoever. They have a port, which is al-Qasr, which is really not suitable for navigation, certainly not for heavy-duty shipping. And on both sides of this port, there are waterways which they share with their neighbors, Kuwait on one side and Iran on the other side.
That's why you used the term virtually landlocked before, right? Because, I mean, there is the opening, but it's not functional, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so Iraq historically has depended on the use of pipelines to ship its oil out of Iraq, and these pipelines go through Syria and Turkey to have access to the Mediterranean. And since Iraq and Syria have had disputes in the past, I think the Iraqi pipeline through Syria has been closed for a while, and so Iraq had to depend on the goodwill of its neighbors.
And Turkey closed that pipeline when the sanctions were put in, which again relates to my whole thing about this last resort criteria, doesn't it? That's what we're trying to say is, if other options been tried, are the economic sanctions going to work? And Turkey, one of the pipelines, is turned that off, which cuts down this flow of the Iraqi oil out, and so they can't sell their oil on the world market.
Right. So are the sanctions working, or is this something you'd like to get into?
No. Let me just wait. Do we want to say a little more? I mean, okay. So we've got 1922. We've got the lines drawn. We've landlocked Iraq fundamentally, and they are dependent on their neighbors in order to use the waterways to get their oil into the Gulf, right? And they need to get through Turkey to get it to the Mediterranean.
Okay. Let me backtrack one bit here.
Okay.
The king of Iraq, who was actually made king by the British, was someone who was not an Iraqi. Eventually, I'm referring here to King Faisal, who is one of the two sons of the Sharif of Mecca, Sharif Hussein, who apparently was promised a greater Syria after the war ends. However, this never happened. One of his sons was made king of Transjordan. That was, King Abdullah, who is the grandfather of the present king of Jordan, King Hussein. The other son of the Sharif of Mecca was made the king of Iraq. Now, Iraq ceased being a monarchy in 1958 following a military coup. In 1963, Iraq did recognize the existence of Kuwait as a separate nation, as a separate entity. However,
1963.
63.
Yeah.
That's when Kuwait gained its independence from the British. However, my understanding of history here is that there remained certain territorial questions which had to be worked out later on, and those were never worked out to the satisfaction of both parties. Now, this could bring us into the 8 years of war between Iraq and Iran, which I think...
We also should get in when Saddam Hussein takes over power, too.
Saddam Hussein takes over in 79, I believe. And he consolidates power, and the reputation of Saddam Hussein as a military man, a dictatorial figure, is probably well-deserved. However, I am not sure he deserves all the attention that we have given him in recent months. Labels such as the Butcher of Baghdad and the Hitler, modern-day Hitler of the Middle East, and so on. I don't think these are useful labels, because the United States government, as well as the European and Soviet governments, worked with Saddam Hussein during his war against Iran.
That's a really important thing to keep in mind in all this, isn't it? The Soviet and U.S. support that Saddam received throughout the war with Iran. And of course, we saw it in our own best interest at that time, since we saw Iran as the great enemy, and especially after the hostage-taking and the fundamentalist movement within Iran. That sort of tilted our policy to support Saddam.
Absolutely, and that brings up a very interesting question, probably a broader question than we have time to get into today. How is our foreign policy driven? What determines our friendships and our enmities in that region? and have we always had the foresight to look at long-range effects in that region of the world? So we have basically used expediency as a guiding force. We haven't had a plan for the Middle East as such.
So one of the plans that we have had is to introduce, of course, these economic sanctions as our means of trying to get Saddam Hussein to withdraw from Kuwait. And I think one of the crucial arguments in all of this, and part of the just war criteria, is that a war could only be the last resort. And I think the question that raises is, will the economic sanctions work? Will they eventually cause Iraq to move into a different posture in the Middle East, withdraw from Kuwait, and negotiate out their differences, which you have set the stage for in terms of that drawing the line and not being a natural border and not having access to the waterways and so on. And I think that the figures I've seen say something like this, that the exports are 97% interdicted at this point. In other words, and their main export, of course, is oil. That's what they make all their money off of and keep going. And supposedly there's about a 97% success rate in interdicting their exports. And I've also seen the figure used that over 90% of their imports have been stopped. Now, one of the questions in my mind, speaking of just as a layman in terms of those economic figures and so on, is how can a country like Iraq withstand that kind of economic pressure over a long period of time? Now, I well understand that they can do that for 4 months or for 5 months, but if you lengthen that out to something like 5 years, do you really want to say you're not going to get any money from your oil over a 5-year period? Are you willing to go along with that? That would be one of the questions one would have to ask. And I think that probably part of the answer comes in understanding Iraq, their mentality, and so on. I know it's often said that they fought for 8 years against Iran. What makes you think they're going to just cave in under economic sanctions? But the difference in my mind is that they were receiving all the support from us and from the Soviets all throughout that period. It wasn't as though there was an embargo keeping them from replenishing military supplies and so on. I've also seen the figure used that within 4 to 9 months that the Iraqis are going to have trouble with spare parts for their military equipment. That once the Soviets have shut off that supply, that after about a 9-month period, the efficiency of their military is going to go down markedly, and it would be exponential as time goes on. They would have more and more trouble keeping their military equipment in fighting shape. So it becomes part of the argument, of course, is that said, well, you can't go to war while you've got another option that might work. And of course then you start to marshal your arguments. Will it work or won't it work? The economic sanctions. I like what Sam Nunn says, if you go to war tomorrow, you'll never know if they worked or not, will you? You'll never know if the sanctions worked or not. So maybe we can wrestle a little bit here with this question of what chances there are for the sanctions to work. Can Iraq survive this, and to what degree, and what are the chances that a man like Saddam Hussein would eventually give in to those sanctions? You want to make some comments on that?
Sure. Before we do that, maybe one parenthetical statement here is that we really should have given negotiations a chance even before we tried to impose the sanctions, and that's something we didn't do very well. And it would be a shame that if we waited for sanctions and for an actual war to break out, and then we would sit down and negotiate, which is what happens very often, while we could have talked beforehand and negotiated. That option was not given enough time. Now,
let's stay with that just a minute.
Okay.
Do you think that has something to do with our misunderstanding of the mentality of the Arab world and of Saddam Hussein in particular? Just one thing that I noted is that much of their language has to do with we're not respected. You don't respect us. President Bush makes a comment that's a great seriousness about us while he's in a golf cart. He makes these offhand remarks. He uses this terrible language against Saddam. They set the date for when we're going to negotiate. We want to set that date. All those things, that the common element I keep seeing in is no respect. They don't respect us. And I wonder if you think that that plays a role in all of this.
I think that's a very, very important point. Jim, we all tend to be ethnocentric. And it's not shameful to be ethnocentric, because we always think of our culture, we think of ourselves of being good people and honest people and so on. And I'm sure the Iraqis think of themselves the same way. Now, the Iraqis, the Middle Easterners, the Arabs, in general, if you get to know them, are very gentle and kind people. They're generous people. They are willing to deal and dicker and negotiate. However, they're also very proud people who are willing to give up, sacrifice, give up their lives even, for matters related to honor and pride and faith.
And maybe religion.
Absolutely. Religion plays a very important role in there. The reason it does is that many of the developing nations of the Middle East, who have somehow discovered that a Western type modernization and technology does not work by itself. So they reverted to the only other thing they know, which has worked for them for centuries, which is religion. Now, it seems to me then that in understanding the people of the region, in understanding the politics and the dynamics of the region, we would have been able to negotiate. Yes, there was an impasse between Iraq and Kuwait with respect to border disputes, as well as disputes over the ownership of oil fields, as well as access to the Gulf. And these are important issues, but I have a feeling they could have been solved either locally, given time and encouragement by us, either at the level of the Arab League or ultimately in the United Nations.
I would like to get in a point there. They might well have been able to be solved, but the fact that the way that Iraq decided to solve it, I think, is indefensible and really needs to be judged an immoral action. And the invasion turns out to be, in my judgment at least, reprehensible. And all that we've heard about the atrocities and so on, I think that has to be factored in. And I think it's a shame that the negotiations couldn't have been fostered, and I'm sure we could have played a role. But then, once they invaded, of course, I mean, I think that we have to make a judgment about that. I would say it's deplorable, reprehensible, and immoral. And
I concur.
And now the question is, what do we do?
What do we do?
And so,
right.
One of the things we'd ask them, well, can Iraq sustain this thing or not?
Right.
I mean,
right.
What if it does go 3 years? Can they sustain an economic embargo for 3 years?
Right. Knowing what we know and listening to expert testimony, I'm sure you and I have been listening to the same testimony, congressional testimony. No, Iraq couldn't possibly survive sanctions like the ones imposed on it nowadays. And I think you outlined the major reasons why, because Iraq is not an industrialized nation. It's not self-sufficient in terms of its agricultural production and industry. Yes, the Iraqis have oil, but they need to sell it. And they need to be able to export technology and spare parts for their weapons. And there is evidence already that factories are slowing down because of the lack of spare parts. So I think the sanctions, given enough time, would definitely work.
And you're basing that on an analysis of the Iraqi economy, really, aren't you?
Absolutely.
I mean, that eventually this hurts them. I mean, they don't have the income from the oil over all this period of time. I mean, it's sooner or later it's going to make a difference. I would liken it to South Africa, where we had sanctions nowhere near as tight as we have on Iraq, and yet eventually it has brought the government around to making some concessions, or at least starting to move in that direction.
They made a difference.
It definitely made a difference, and one would expect that in Iraq, given enough time. When we begin to if people try to argue on the other side of that, I know they've said, well, the coalition will fall apart, and we won't be able to sustain the sanctions. That we won't be able to interdict this flow. And I would say, even if you would say that, well, maybe it will. Maybe, there'll be more ways for them to get goods, although if they don't have money, they're not going to be able to buy it on the black market. That's another factor. But maybe some of the Arab countries will loosen up or whatever. But still, we will be able to sustain a large part of that embargo. And I would think it would hurt them in the long run.
I agree.
Samir, we're going to run out of time here, and I need to try to focus this just a little bit for myself at least. And, my argument is we shouldn't invade Iraq. I see it as an immoral option at this point. And one of the reasons we shouldn't launch this military attack is that we haven't given the sanctions a chance yet. And if we gave them a longer period, they might well work. And so, I go back to the testimony of important people like Admiral Crowe and James Schlesinger and 6 out of 7 former secretaries of defense, all arguing, saying, give it a chance, give the sanctions a chance, and they may well work if we just stick with the course here. And I think so. I'm trying to marshal all these arguments in a sense that say, that this is not the way to go. And so the just war criteria at least guides me in this regard to say that would be immoral, and I want to speak out against it, and I'm looking to form coalitions of people who sort of agree with that.